right, here we are with some video to support preparing for the test number 3 next Tuesday, April the 28th, covering topics 4 and 5. I have in mind here folks who will be trying to raise their grade using test number 3, because everyone else really will be able to learn topics 4 and 5 pretty well by taking the test a few times and using the fill-in-the-blank approach to supplement the notes. So notice here's the web page announcing the test coming up on the 28th, and of course the materials for it are on the active outline. So let's click on that, and there's your active learning outline, and up here we see that we have highlighted links to topics 4 and 5. Topic 4, go back to the top of the page, choose topic 5, because there's already topic 4 videos available. So what I'd like to do quickly is to run through the notes for topic 5, helping you organize your thinking about them, anticipating coverage on the test. There's the notes loading as they're going to appear to you. Yeah, that kind of works, but what I'm going to do now is switch over to my actual notes and use them to highlight so that we're not wasting your time waiting for loading. Alright, so notice that we've divided topic 5 into 2 parts. We've got a macro perspective on slavery and the Southern economy, and we've got a micro perspective, which I like to think of as slavery and the African American experience. This video is going to focus on topic 5.1, guiding you through the macroeconomic perspective that Economics 310 offers on slavery and the Southern economy. These data on the per capita GDP in the U.S. as a whole and in the different regions, we should call the North and the South sections, and the places within the North and the South, call those regions. These are data we've looked at before, and we want to we want to use these data to explore the macroeconomic perspective on slavery. With the organizing question noted here, to what extent was the South a poor and stagnant economy? I confess that if we were doing this in the regular meeting situation, we'd add a third adjective, which is a notion of backwardness. Was the South a backward economy? I made a few comments about that at the end of the notes, but we're not going to have time for that sort of nuanced discussion in this online format. All right, instead, let's start with the question, was the antebellum South a poor economy? Note antebellum, ante, before, bellum, war. Antebellum is the general term for the South in the period from about 1810 or 20 up to 1860. The Civil War unfolding shortly after that. Okay, was the South poor? Go through the data and make sure you're comfortable with the notion that there are 2 different ways to look at the South. One way to look at it is to suggest the South was poor, and the other way to look at it enables you to say, no, the South was not poor. What I think is useful for you, more generally than 310, is to think about how 1880 is this key point in our data. It's in 1880 that the South emerges as a really poor place in the United States, on the North American continent actually, with per capita GDP only 1/2 of the national level. The point, of course, is that it had never been that poor before, and we wonder, and I guess this is my own view, I wonder whether the 20th century South and how poor it was in the context of the 20th century, whether that, I was going to say infects, but informs the thought that the slave South would have been a poor economy. Roughly, maybe the reasoning is the following. Man, if the South was so poor in the 1920s, 30s, 40s, can you imagine how poor it must have been under slavery? Because we know slavery is awful. Well, yeah, slavery's awful morally, but it turned out that for the people in charge, the slavery was enormously profitable, generating huge incomes for the owners based on the work of the enslaved people. And make sure you're familiar with some of those data to be able to see in what sense the South was poor and in what sense it was rich, and I hope then you'll understand that the general idea of the conclusion. Whether you see the antebellum South as poor is a matter of perspective. All right, let's move quickly on and highlight the key points in the notion of whether the South was a stagnant economy. Ideally, you'll remember way back in aggregate economic history, the exam question was the colonial economy stagnant, and the answer was, well, yes, stagnant in the sense of a lack of economic growth. The colonial economy had almost none, maybe a tiny bit of economic growth, certainly not the 1% or more growth of per capita output that we associate with modern economic growth. So, the key point for whether the South was stagnant is, of course, to look to the data and say, there's the South. The South per capita GDP grew at an annual rate of 1.65% per year in the 2 decades before the Civil War. That is not a stagnant economy. And if you remember Greg Clark's hockey stick picture, World Economic History in one picture. Let's get that up real quick. Pause. There, I hope you can see the Clark's figure, World Economic History in one picture, that famous hockey stick. And the point to understand, of course, is for thousands of years, human beings did not experience economic growth, going along all the way until what is described as the Industrial Revolution, at which point exponential growth, modern economic growth, meant climbing incomes per person for the past 100 or 200 years. And for many people, it's an astonishing finding that the antebellum South, this slave-based economy, 40% of the people enslaved, slaves working a lot, so more than 40% of the labor force enslaved, that sort of an economy was experiencing modern economic growth, strikes people as a astonishing result. Okay, so back to the main lines, and again, just make sure you can identify this key point that the South was not a stagnant economy, that it was experiencing modern economic growth in the sense of expanding per capita output as evidenced by expanding per capita GDP. Now, what's more interesting and more nuanced is a comparison of southern and northern economic growth. Now here, just like with the question of whether the South is poor or not, so too with the question of whether the South was going faster or slower than the North, you can look at it in 2 different ways. The starting point, of course, is to just look at each section and to notice that the North's economic growth is slower than the South's. The North's economic growth is 1.29% per year. The South's is 1.65% per year. Okay, so the South's economic growth is faster. However, those of you who look closely will say, wait a minute, within each of the northern regions, we see greater economic growth, about 1.6 or 1.7% per year, than we see in any of the southern regions. So, southern regions. So we look at each section, north versus south. The south is growing faster, but if we look at the northern regions compared to the southern regions, the north is growing faster. And what's potentially even more confusing than just the ambiguity of where the growth is faster is to notice the discrepancies between the regional growths. Northeast and Midwest are both growing faster than the North as a whole. Similarly, there's apparent discrepancy or anomaly. The southern regions are experiencing slower economic growth than the South as a whole. So think about that for a minute, ask how that can be, and then read the notes that follow down here and make sure you're able to go, oh, yeah, of course that's what's going on. Okay, I hope you've had a chance to look at these notes and recognize this idea of a simple explanation based on or stemming from the migration of population from the east to the west. And you can read through the detailed discussion I have below, but let's just go up and look at the numbers for a minute, and I think maybe if we think of an extreme situation, it'll become obvious. Imagine that we are looking just at 1840, and imagine that we were looking in the north. Thought experiment. What if everybody moved from the northeast, where incomes are $129 per person, and they all moved to the Midwest, where incomes are only $65 per person? Well, then we'd see a decline in in the North's per capita GDP down to the Midwestern level of 65. Or, if there'd been growth over the 20-year period, then maybe we imagine a complete migration out of the Northeast into the Midwest, but that would result in the North's per capita GDP being only $89. This is just illustrating the point that migration from east to west in the North is going to pull down per capita incomes. The average levels of income are higher in the east than in the west, so moving population from the east to the west is going to reduce per capita GDP. Look at the south, and it's the opposite effect. The two eastern parts of the South Atlantic and the eastern part, this is like Georgia and I think eastern Alabama. These places are distinctly poorer than the West South Central, and the population moving from east to west is taking people to a richer area. So that's going to have the effect of elevating per capita GDPs. So that's the simple explanation, and as I discussed down here, when we model the regional shift, which you may or may not want to work through, when you look through this, you should be reminded of the topic, part one of the class, when we saw the sectoral shift of labor from agriculture to manufacturing, boosting the average labor productivity in the economy. These three sentences all go together nicely. Those of you who tackled the sectoral shift questions on test 1 and exam 1 are encouraged to dig back into that learning in order to make sure that what is a simple point remains a simple point. And then you can just hit the pause button if you want and digest that, but I'm going to move quickly on and look at the associated issue that arises from these data. And that is the point that although the numbers are simple and the South is easy to make sense of because the migration is from the richer, in the South the migration makes sense because the migration is from the poorer region to the richer region. In the North we've got a puzzle. This puzzle is called the Easterland Paradox, after the great late economist Richard Easterland. Economic historian Richard Easterland, who went on to become famous for happiness studies. In his happiness studies, read Greg Clark's stuff on that if you want. We got to move on. Easterland Paradox simply says, how is it that the population in the North is migrating from the richest part of the economy, one of the richest parts of the world, the Northeast, and moving out to the Midwest, which is poor? Go back to these data and look at this. Remind yourself, oh yeah, the Midwest in 1860 is the poorest region of the country. How come it's attracting all these people? Well, you're not going to be able to answer that question in any fullness, but as noted here, there are three different explanations for the Easterland Paradox that you want to make sure that you're familiar with. One of them is kind of an interesting twist in the sense that it's suggesting that sometimes economics doesn't have all the answers. Maybe people were actually moving west and sacrificing income because they wanted independence, the idea of getting their own land and being on their own farms. This might harken back to our discussions of migration across the Atlantic in the colonial period and the question of whether coming to get land was something that particularly attracted the free migrants from Europe who came from societies where land ownership was exclusively the privilege of the nobles and very few others. Anyhow, be alert to the other two explanations for the Easterland Paradox as well. One is kind of an idea of inequality with reference to returns to labor versus returns to capital and land. It's possible that there was a sort of inequality in the Northeast so that ordinary folks were making very low wages, and those low wages in the factories and as employees on eastern farms were generating high incomes for the owners of the factories, and maybe landowners were making lots of money, but maybe labor incomes were low, and by moving to the Midwest, they went to a place where factory incomes were low and landlords didn't make much money, but there was lots of wages, higher wages in the Midwest. And there is some evidence to suggest that was the case. And finally, there is this notion more generally of opportunity in the form of low-priced land in the Midwest, kind of connecting us back to the transportation revolution and land policy topics we've covered in 310. And so maybe it's kind of a notion of moving there for expectations of higher income in the future. But in any case, there's just a lot more research needed to pin it down. Now, the next page of notes is probably more in-depth and more nuanced than we can worry about handling in an online environment. You're welcome to just kind of look it over, but I'm not going to pay any attention to it for the most part so that you don't worry about it. The only part really worth talking about in closing up this first part of topic 5 is to remind you of the notion of counterfactuals in history. The idea of doing history by saying, well, what if? What would have happened if? And the counterfactual in this case that people look at for talking about slavery in the Southern economy is the question of, well, hey, what if slavery had been abolished with the American Revolution, as many people had hoped it would, as some of us think it should have been, to be consistent with the ideals being celebrated and inspiring people at the time. But anyhow, if slavery had been abolished, and so then we'd had a free labor economy south and north, then maybe the South would have kept up with the North. We can connect that to the Ingerman and Sokoloff discussion, because certainly slavery in the South generated a much more unequal society than there was in the North, with incomes for the elites and policies supporting elites' well-being and not supporting broad-based development. And so in short, the counterfactual is that if the people had all been emancipated in the 1780s after the Revolution or with the Revolution, the South would have developed like the Midwest did. So sure, it still would have been poor as of, say, 1860. But then in the 1870s, 1880s, 1890s, both the South and the Midwest could have undergone something like an industrial revolution. Of course, that glosses over all sorts of interesting issues of history, but the notion of counterfactual, it's important for you to be alert to it, because if you go back to the numbers, these numbers for 1860 really mean that people are no longer saying, hey, why was the South so poor in 1860? They're saying, how come the South wasn't as poor as we expected, and would the South have been richer or poorer if they hadn't had slavery? And would the South in 1900 and the South in 1950 have been richer or poorer in the absence of slavery? Maybe those point to all sorts of interesting broader questions about North and South differences in this country. But those are beyond the scope of our questions, so I'm going to say that's it for now. If you have any questions or comments, please put them on the piazza. So, bye-bye. Good health to all.